we'll go.
We're a little early. She reminded me we're supposed to do 1965, but this is President's Month. And given that this is President's Month, the month of February, I'm doing a whole series of talks about people like him, Woodrow Wilson, who was the president in 1921. Well, actually, his wife was the president in 1921, Edith Wilson.
Oh,
Because
that's my name,
he
Edith.
had, Edith, there you go, Edith. So you were the president in 1921.
Edith too.
Yeah. Anyway, he had a stroke in October of 1919. He was an invalid. He was totally incapacitated. And she ran the country, Edith Wilson. And
Sure, I did.
Oh, you did? You ran the
Absolutely.
country.
That was me.
That was you. But you weren't born yet. You had another few months before that you were born.
You can't lose your sense of humor.
No, you can't. So anyway, but she was the de facto president of the United States in 1919, 1920, and 1921. And there is a new president, Warren G. Harding. And there was the 1921 Emergency Quota Act, which said immigrants stay away. They did not want immigrants in the country. Or if they did, they had to come from England or Germany or the Scandinavian countries. They couldn't come from Eastern Europe. And put two and two together, and what does Eastern Europe say?
No.
No Jews, no Italians. That's what they didn't want. This was the Tulsa Massacre. And for many, 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 many years, this was buried. And that is what was known as Black Wall Street going up into smoke during that territory. And Warren G. Harding was a lot of things. He was a womanizer. He had an illegitimate child. He was blackmailed by a former lover who was about ready to come out in 1920 saying that yeah, I've had a 15-year affair with this guy, so he was blackmailed. But he did do a number of things that were rather interesting. 1921, Harding's Birmingham race speech, and he's talking about political and economic equality for the Negro, which was a massive, massive, massive change. The president never really spoke out about it. And here all of a sudden is Warren G. Harding going right in the heart of Dixie, Birmingham, Alabama, talking about race relations in the country. And this guy, Adolf Hitler, is gaining some followers. Women, they begin to assert themselves, like your mother, right? Your mother, she wore high heels, she smoked, I bet you she drank. She drank too? She drank as well. So, Flapper World, that's a magazine from 1921, and she might have dressed like that because that was the
I
Flapper
have
look.
pictures.
Yeah, you have pictures. There you go. So you have proof. Prohibition, 1921, for some people. Other people, they know where to get booze. And did Babe Ruth save baseball in 1921? A lot of people will tell you that he did. Did you see Babe Ruth what? Back in the day? There will be a lot of people who tell you that Babe Ruth saved baseball, and that's not exactly true. Radio becomes commercially viable with this fight in Jersey City in July of 1921, which was broadcast throughout the nation. Fatty Arbuckle was charged with rape and murder, and that ended his career, even though he was acquitted. And there she is, Miss America, except it wasn't known as the Miss America pageant back in 1921, but it was held on the boardwalk in Atlantic City. And Bert Parks wasn't there. How many of you remember Bert Parks singing There She Is, Miss America? How many remember when Johnny Carson had this campaign to save Bert Parks to make sure that he was the host of the Miss America pageant, but they got rid of him. President is dangerously ill. The Bisbee Daily Review. And, well, he was dangerously ill. In fact, he was so ill that he was incapacitated between October of 1919 and when he left office on March 4th, 1921. For 17 months, The United States had a de facto woman president, his wife Edith. She was the one. And she got together with his doctor, Dr. Grayson. Basically, they plotted how to keep the fact that Woodrow Wilson was an invalid and was paralyzed out of the media, which was newspapers in those days, and how to keep the word silence. And that's what they wanted to do. It's October 2nd, 1919, and Woodrow Wilson suffered a severe stroke and never would recover. The public was never told of Wilson's stroke. The cover-up began, led by the doctor, Cary Grayson, and Wilson's wife, Edith. They thought it would be best if Wilson was not informed of just how serious his condition truly was. When Dr. Grayson briefed the cabinet, the question of secession came up, but he refused to sign any official notice of disability. He also discouraged letting the public know the extent of the president's condition. Believe it or not, nobody saw this guy. But then again, the only thing that was around in those days, well, some film, because there was some film around, and newspapers. But you never saw him. And they kept making excuses. And there is Edith Wilson making sure that her husband attempts to sign some legislation. He was in bad shape. Woodrow Wilson wanted to run for a third term in 1920, but he was unable to campaign for another term as president. The strongest candidate the Democrats could have put forward for the presidency in 1920 was probably William McAdoo, who was the Treasury Secretary, and he was Wilson's son-in-law. He married Wilson's daughter, Eleanor. McAdoo was unable to launch the all-out campaign that was required to get the nomination. The party went with a compromise candidate, the Ohio Governor James Cox, who lost by a landslide to the Ohio Senator Warren Harding. Cox and Harding were both newspaper guys. Harding had his paper in Marion, Ohio. So they were both newspaper editors. Harding got into politics. Cox became the governor of Ohio. The 1920 election was a referendum on Woodrow Wilson, as Harding called for a return to normalcy, whatever that meant, and blamed all the country's troubles on the man in the White House. Cox ran on domestic issues such as unemployment and inflation, but not Wilson's internationalism. Wilson wanted to save the world from war with the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations, and he came up short both times. The Republicans won by a landslide, which they interpreted as a mandate to reverse Wilson's progressive policies at home and his internationalism abroad. So what did return to normalcy actually mean? Might have been Harding's conception of normalcy, which included business deregulation, civic engagement, and isolation. After the stroke, he's still in office. They did not remove him. He goes until March the 4th, that's 2 months into the new year. For 17 months, he's a near invalid. His wife looked after him carefully and was suspected of making important decisions to him. And she probably did, although he can't be proven. Here's the limousine ride. Warren G. Harding is the first president ever to go to his inauguration in a car. Wilson was the last one to go to an inauguration in a horse-drawn carriage. Wilson is in a car. That's 103 years ago. Warren G. Harding was shocked by the president having to be physically lifted into the automobile as they shared on the way to his inauguration. Nervous. Now, Harding was one of these party boys. I mean, he's one of these guys who could probably charm the ears off a snake, if you know what I mean. But he's nervous here. He chats with Wilson and discusses his fondness for elephants. Harding told the tale of an elephant that was dying and wailing mournfully for his trainer. Once the trainer appeared, the elephant gently wrapped his trunk around his friend, drew him close to an embrace, sighed, and died. Harding looked at the president and was surprised to see tears streaming down Wilson's partially paralyzed face. Harding joked that he always wanted to have an elephant as a pet himself, and Wilson composed himself enough to say he hoped it wouldn't be a white elephant. A white elephant. There you go. A white elephant. A white elephant is a possession that its owner cannot dispose of and whose cost, particularly that of maintenance, is out of proportion to its usefulness. And here is the new President of the United States. Hey, come on in, we'll have some alcohol, maybe we'll have some broads around, you can play poker, drink some whiskey. Hey, it's all here in the White House. Let's get on with it, let's start the party. Look at him, does he look like he's about ready to start the party? Does he? Yeah, he was. Warren G. Harding was a small town, Marion, Ohio newspaper publisher who somehow got into politics and began winning elections. He was in the Senate when he became a compromise candidate for the Republican nomination for the presidency in 1920. Had a very thin record in the Senate, but ladies liked his looks. They thought he was virile and handsome, and he photographed well. He looked like a president, said Harry Daugherty, one of his Ohio cronies and backers. Harding won by promising Americans a return to normalcy after World War I. But he certainly looked like a president, even though Harding once said, "I'm not fit for this office and I should never have been here." He was unsuited for the job of President of the United States. His wife Florence was instrumental in shaping Warren Harding's political career. He had a lot of luggage, but somehow the Republican Party was able to quash that Harding had an illegitimate daughter who was born in 1919 and may have been blackballed by a former lover. It's a good thing I'm not a woman, he once told reporters. I'd always be pregnant. I can't say no. Harding served liquor in the White House despite the 18th Amendment ban on alcohol. Harding, after all, was the country's top law enforcement official. And by serving liquor, he broke the law. He broke the law. Oh, that's Nan Britton. He allegedly had sex with the young Nan Britton right next to the Oval Office while he was in the White House in 1921, 1922, 1923, and she is the mother of his daughter. Nan Britton grew up in Marion. Her father knew Harding, and Harding's sister was her school teacher. She was kind of a Warren G. Harding groupie as a teenager. She was consumed with Harding, who was married but had no children, and was seen by women at the time as very attractive. Nan Britton hung pictures of Harding on her bedroom wall. He was 31 years older than her, and she's like 15, 16, when she's hanging pictures of him on her bedroom wall, and then eventually she would seek his help finding a job. And he agreed to meet her in New York in July 1917. She's 20 years old, and she became Mrs. Harding's bride, as she put it, during a New York hotel tryst. Sometime during 1918, as part of their affair, they had some fun in Harding's Senate office, and 9 months later, Britton gave birth to a daughter. Elizabeth Ann was born on October 22nd, 1919. Harding never met her, but the checks were going to Nan Britton. He knew it was his daughter, and he was paying her $5,000 a year, which is a lot of money back in those days. The affair was buried by the Republicans, and it was an open secret.
Well, like today.
Yeah, but newspapers didn't bother to report on it. And there's the woman who almost blackmailed him. A woman by the name of Carrie Phillips. See, you thought I'd come in here and there'd be no salacious tales of anything. It'd just be a boring talk, right? Warren Harding is not boring. Not boring at all. He began his extramarital romance with Carrie Phillips in 1905 when he was Ohio's lieutenant governor, and continued it after his 1914 Senate election. Phillips may have been a German sympathizer during World War I, And this causes Warren G. Harding some problems because he's got to vote on whether or not to go to war, and he's there with his friend Jerry. Well, Jerry and Warren never parted company. Jerry was always with Warren G. Harding, and he was with Carrie Fulton Phillips. She tried to influence Senator Harding to vote against going to war with Germany in 1917. Harding and his friend Jerry broke up with Phillips, but Phillips was not going away. The Republican National Committee, fearing a major scandal during the 1920 election, agreed to give Phillips $2,000 a month and $25,000 to pay for a cruise to Japan and China during the fall of 1920. Well, if you're on the cruise ship back in 1920, there's no communication between the sea and the United States. She's out of sight. She can't tell any newspaper people about using Warren's friend Jerry for 15 years in a romance, and if you really have the time, you could read the love letters with Warren and his friend Jerry and Carrie Phillips. They'll turn your stomach, some of those letters. So she's out of the way. They paid her off to get rid of her. By the time Phillips returned to America, Harding had been elected to the White House. The newspaper people in Washington at the time didn't bother to investigate the rumors that Harding was paying off Nan Britton and was paying off Carrie Phillips. Hey, why would they want to do that? Meanwhile, he's throwing parties at the White House. So this is Warren G. Harding's new world. He is now the President of the United States. And being the President of the United States, he's supposed to be the most powerful man in the world. Well, he is, right? The 1920s did not get off to a good start in America. At the conclusion of World War I, U.S. officials found themselves in a bleak position. The federal debt had exploded because of wartime expenditures, and the annual consumer price inflation rates had jumped well above 20% by the end of the war. And then I had two great uncles who died in this. The Spanish flu pandemic in the United States began in spring 1918, returned in waves in 1920. That's when both of my uncles, great uncles, I should say, died because of the flu. It killed about 167,000 Americans because a large fraction of deaths were among working-age adults. The resulting economic dislocation was especially severe. The unemployment rate, 11.7%. American politicians and the public wanted immigration reform to the point where just Western Europeans could enter the country. Immigration, high unemployment, alcohol consumption were three of the major factors that caused the rise in Ku Klux Klan numbers. The campaign against immigrants. You come to the United States, you learn to be an American. In fact, you can't see this, so I will just tell you. This is translated into all kind of languages, including Yiddish, right here. It's also in Russian and a few other languages. You come to America, you better learn the language, and you better assimilate immediately. Before the Act of 1921, there were smaller attempts to restrict immigration. The most important was the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which was quite a bold law that singled out for the first time an ethnic group for restriction. Starting in the 1880s, there was a historic wave of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, like my family. How many of you in here can trace your roots back to Eastern Europe? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, almost everybody in here. What they were against? The Jews, the Italians. Lawmakers tried to stem that wave. They wanted to stop the Jews and Italians from coming. They couldn't do it, but they were trying. They gave a literacy test. My grandfather, probably if the literacy test was around in the late 1890s, early 1900s when he came over, probably would have failed the literacy test, which means that somebody else would be here right now talking to you. The literacy test was a device to restrict the total number of immigrants while not offending the large element of ethnic voters. The old immigration, the British, the Dutch, the Irish, Germans, Scandinavians, had fallen off. And they were replaced by new immigrants from Italy, Russia, and other points in Southern and Eastern Europe. The old immigrants were voters and strongly approved of restricting the new immigrants. 1896, my grandfathers, on my father's side, they came over roughly around that time. The 1896 Republican platform called for a literacy test. The campaigns against immigrants, and that's Ellis Island, and through that door, you got into the United States. There were no such things as papers back in those days. Nothing. You came, you went to Boston, you went to Galveston, you went to Ellis Island, they looked at you, and they said, okay, you're not sick, you can come in. You went to Halifax in what was British territory at that time. You went to St. John, New Brunswick. How many of you heard of MGM, the movie house? Yeah. MGM, Louis B. Mayer, came into North America through St. John, New Brunswick, and then ended up in the movies. Literary tests were vetoed rather. Literary tests were vetoed in 1913 by William Howard Taft. Anybody here with roots from the Lower East Side, like me? Where, do you remember where?
7th and Avenue D.
Oh, Avenue D, okay. 7th and 8th. I'm from Eldridge Street.
Street.
My father was born on Lewis Street.
Lewis Street. My mother-in-law was on Lewis Street and then the Turley Street down there. Well, William Howard Taft, the President of the United States, visited the Lower East Side in 1913. And he explained his, literacy tests were vetoed in 1913. Before William Howard Taft was out of office. He left office on March the 4th. The President explained his veto saying, "It was a visit through the Lower East Side of Manhattan that led me to veto the immigration bill containing the literacy test when it finally came to me. I saw among the young men and girls of the East Side a spirit of appreciation, gratitude, patriotism that wouldn't hurt some of those whose fathers and great-grandfathers were born in this country." So how many of you came from the Lower East Side? Probably around that time?
Yeah, well,
Probably I'm not talking about you, but your parents or grandparents.
yeah.
You were from Lewis Street,
Yeah.
Lower East Side. William Howard Taft looked at the Lower East Side, not with disgust, but he was kind of proud of the people on the Lower East Side back before he left office in 1913. Taft had no problems with Manhattan's Lower East Side Jews, but somebody in the State Department did. State Department official referred to the recent waves of Jewish immigrants and called them filthy, un-American, and often dangerous in their habits. Were your parents dangerous in their habits?
No.
Were they filthy?
No.
That was the word about the Jews of the Lower East Side back in the day. Well, the Emergency Quota Act, again, this is Ellis Island. I came from Eldridge Street, Suffolk Street, Hester Street. My father actually had a TV repair store at 88 Hester Street. And of course, there was the book Hester Street as well. And that's where I came from. And I probably would have a problem with that guy in the State Department who said that we were dangerous people. I don't know, you know me, am I a dangerous person? So, anyway, on May 19th, Congress had imposed a quota that limited immigration for persons of any nationality to 3% of that nationality present in 1910, with an annual admission of 356,000 immigrants. This national origin system was structured to discriminate against Eastern and Southern European immigrants such as Italians, Russians, Poles, Slavs, and Yiddish-speaking Jews. All's not well in 1921. It's the Black Wall Street, Tulsa, Oklahoma. All's not well at all. The Tulsa Massacre tore through the Greenwood District in Tulsa, Oklahoma. On May 31st and June 1st, white mobs ravaged the black neighborhood, destroying businesses, killing citizens. Greenwood was also known as Black Wall Street, one of the wealthiest black communities in the United States. In the aftermath of the First World War, racial tensions were particularly high in the United States, with racially motivated violence taking place all over the country. Tulsa itself was very segregated. It also was the oil capital of the United States at that time, the oil capital. And Greenwood housed the majority of the city's black residents. In segregated Tulsa, buying black became more a matter of survival and less a matter of choice. And that was what Black Wall Street looked like. It was a clean neighborhood, wasn't it? Dentists there. Looked pretty good. What do you think from that picture? What do you think? Look good? Segregation laws prevented black residents from shopping in white neighborhoods because of a desire to keep money circulating in their own community. Greenwood residents collectively funneled their cash into local black businesses. Greenwood became a robust and self-sustaining community. Barbershops, salons, clothing stores, jewelers, restaurants, taverns, pool halls, movie houses, grocers, offices for doctors, dentists, and lawyers. There were 108 black-owned businesses in Greenwood. Well, nabbed Negro for attacking girl in an elevator. And that's what's,
Where was Greenwood?
Greenwood's Tulsa, that was the neighborhood. That was the neighborhood. Nabbed Negro for attacking a girl in an elevator. And that sets it off. The massacre began when Dick Rowland, a black teenager, went into an elevator in an office building along with an elevator operator by the name of Sarah Page. When the scream was heard from Page, Rowland ran away but was arrested the following day by police. Rapidly, stories spread across the white communities, especially when the Tulsa Tribune newspaper printed a story claiming that Page had been sexually assaulted by Rowland. With an angry white group outside the courthouse, 25 black men armed went to the courthouse in an effort to protect Rowland. Later that evening, 75 black men were there, and they were faced off against 1,500 white men, and the tensions began to grow. Captured Negroes on the way to Convention Hall, burning Tulsa. That's what the caption says on that picture, June 1st. Chaos broke out between the two groups. Gunshots were heard with multiple violent, racially motivated acts against black people carried, including the shooting of an unarmed man in a cinema. Eventually, as the hysteria continued, thousands of whites headed to Greenwood to burn homes and businesses belonging to the black community. Rioters even threatened firefighters who were called to put out the fires in the burning buildings. When the National Guard arrived, martial law had been declared and the riot was pretty much over. And this is what it looked like. Remember the first picture I showed you? Nice, quaint little area? This is what it looked like after the May 31st, June 1st Tulsa massacre.
What year was that?
1921. You know what? You didn't learn about it in schools.
No.
You didn't learn about it in
No.
schools. It was hidden. They tried to just suffocate it. And it would take a long time before people talked about it again. As a result of the massacre, Rowland had all of his charges dropped, and the police claimed the most likely situation was that Rowland stepped on Page's foot. Following the situation, it had been reported that Rowland had escaped Tulsa and never returned. The attack destroyed more than 35 blocks of businesses, a wealthy stretch of town considered Black Wall Street, and killed perhaps as many as 300 people. Reports of the attack were subsequently suppressed. That was it. The newspapers didn't report on it. No radio, so to speak. Certainly no television. No.
That year was what?
1921. It's not surprising that the Tulsa Tribune was the one who led everything in terms of how bad it was, because Richard Lloyd Jones owned the Tulsa Tribune, he was a racist. Oh, the other thing, the Ku Klux Klan was growing in Oklahoma. More than 1,200 homes were destroyed. 10,000 black Tulsans were homeless. In addition, black-owned businesses and institutions totally destroyed. 12 churches, 5 hotels, 31 restaurants, 4 drugstores, 8 doctors' offices, 2 dozen grocery stores. And the National Guard rounded up 6,000 black citizens and put them in concentration camps. The offices of the city's 2 black-owned newspapers, the Tulsa Star and the Oklahoma Sun, also destroyed. Another picture of the massacre. Another picture of the massacre. Several newspapers immediately covered the devastation, including the Tulsa World, the New York Times, the Times of London. And while some white Tulsans boasted about the bloodshed and sold photographic postcards, they sold postcards of the devastation that you can mail. But quickly, a culture of silence became the norm. We'll never talk about it again. Tulsa was trying to maintain its place as the oil capital of the world, and the riot reflected terribly on the city. Well, what do you think? Riot made the city look good, yes or no?
No.
No. People also wanted to move on, and newspapers and magazines also moved on from the story. No one was ever held responsible for the murders committed during the massacre or the destruction of Greenwood. Everybody got away with it. Nobody was arrested.
Got away with murder, no?
So Warren G. Harding, a lot of things you could say about him. Party boy, playboy, reckless. He had an illegitimate child. You know, almost got blackmailed by a woman. In fact, he did get blackmailed by a woman. They paid off the woman to go away. Yet he's a civil rights activist. At a time when it was unpopular to be a civil rights activist in 1921. Warren Harding spent the weekend worrying over how to respond to the massacre. Finally, he decided to accept the commencement invitation from Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, the nation's first degree-granting historically black institution. The school was referred to as the Black Princeton. On June 6th, Harding spoke briefly about Tulsa. God grant that, in the soberness, the fairness, and the justice of this country, we never see another spectacle like it. Before speaking, the president was shown a granite arch erected in memory of Negro soldiers who died during the World War, World War I. In his talk, said that the colored soldiers earned this honor by their efforts. The president spoke also of the great benefits of education in furthering the welfare of Negroes, and contrasted the fine scene presented at the university with those enacted in race disturbances. And that would be also the rioting of Red Summer in 1919. It would not be the last time Harding, the party boy, would speak about civil rights in the United States. Birmingham, Alabama. You might remember from the 1960s that Birmingham was the epicenter of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Well, there's Warren G. Harding, and it's October 26th, and he is in Birmingham, and he is giving a speech on race relations. Race relations. I would say let the black man vote when he is fit to vote, prohibit the white man voting when he is unfit to vote. Harding gave a speech before 30,000 people in segregated Birmingham, Alabama. Whites and blacks separated at the event. It was a risky speech to give in Birmingham and the Deep South, as racial tensions were really high. I can say to you, people of the South, both black and white, that the time has passed when you are entitled to assume that the problem of race is peculiarly and particularly your problem. It's the problem of democracy everywhere. If we mean the things we say about democracy as the ideal political state, whether you like it or not, our democracy is a lie unless you stand for that equality. Harding also condemned the lynching of blacks by Southerners. That was one hell. Now, he didn't completely talk about equality, but he got as close as you can for a politician in 1921 to discuss it. Oh, was Warren G. Harding a women's rights activist? What do you think? Yes or no?
Yes.
Well, you know the answer is going to be yes. On November 23rd, Harding signed the Promotion of the Welfare and Hygiene of Maternity and Infancy Act, called the Shepard-Towner Act, into law. The legislation, which provided federal funding for maternity and child care, was sponsored by the Texas Democrat Senator Morris Shepard and the Iowa Republican Representative Horace Mann Towner. Warren G. Harding wanted to take care of pregnant women and the infants because infant mortality was pretty
What
high.
year was that?
1921. There was a high infant mortality rate, and Warren G. Harding got funds for women to get medical care. This is the playboy. This is the guy that was, had all these things surrounding him. The act responded to the lack of adequate medical care for women and children. The Department of Labor's Children Bureau found that 80% of expectant mothers did not receive any advice or trained care. In investigating infant and maternal mortality rates, the Bureau found 111.2 deaths per 1,000 live births, a rate higher than most industrialized countries. Warren G. Harding actually would reduce the mortality rate. And he knows another thing. You need roads. You need roads to get to places, because the car has become an important part of America at this point. The Federal Highway Act of 1921, signed into law by Harding on November 9th. The Federal Highway Act of 1921, also called the Phipps Act, sponsored by Senator Lawrence C. Phipps, Colorado Republican, defined the federal aid road program to develop an immense national highway system. The plan was crafted by the head of the National Highway Commission, Thomas Harris McDonald, and was the first coherent plan for the nation's future roads. This guy, is not rated very highly by historians, and yet he seemed to do a lot in 1921. Also, 1921 Act rejected the view of long-distance road advocates who wanted the federal government to build a national highway network. To satisfy them, the Act limited federal aid to a system of federal aid highways not to exceed 7% of all roads in the state. 3/7 of the system must consist of roads interstate in character. Up to 60% of federal aid funds could be used on these interstate roads. Anybody ever read this book, Main Street? Sinclair Lewis? In 1921, it was one of the most important books that was published in 1920, late 1920, but it became one of the most important books of the year. Sinclair Lewis's Main Street is a satirical novel about small-town life and is notable for the presence of a strong female protagonist. It's Lewis' portrait of Gopher Prairie, Minnesota, and it shattered the myth of the American Midwest as God's country. It became a symbol of the cultural narrow-mindedness and smug complacency of small towns everywhere. The book sold 180,000 copies. The Pulitzer Prize novel jury recommended Main Street for the prize, but Columbia University trustees decided the book failed to give the wholesome requirement in the Pulitzer plan of awards and gave the prize to The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton. Why did Columbia pull back on the Pulitzer? Rather simple. They didn't like the book and what it portrayed. Insulin was discovered in 1921. We have insulin. It's July 27th, and Canadian doctors Frederick Banting and Charles Best successfully isolated the hormone insulin, one of the most important breakthroughs ever in treating diabetes. over there, over there. Remember that song? Right? The Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming, and it won't be over until it's over there. Well, it is over there. First World War and the subsequent peace settlements gave rise to new ambitions, rivalries, and tensions. People had high expectations that the post-war peace settlement would create a new world order and ensure that the slaughter of the First World War was never repeated. And here's Woodrow Wilson, and he's with George Clemenceau and Vittorio Orlando and David Lloyd George, Prime Minister of Britain. They're the big four, and they carve up Europe. And they wanted to make sure that Germany was severely punished and that a German surrender was not enough. German soldiers, like the wounded Adolf Hitler, were infuriated with the settlement. Hitler made it known in 1919 he hated Jews. So why did he hate Jews? Well, during the First World War, between 1914 and 1918, he was a soldier in the German army. And at the end of the war, he and many other German soldiers like him couldn't get over the defeat of the German Empire. The German army command spread the myth, the big lie, the myth, that the army, they didn't lose on the battlefield. They had been betrayed. Well, who betrayed them? It was called the stab in the back. Hitler bought into the lie, the myth. Jews and communists had betrayed the country and brought a left-wing government to power that wanted to throw in the towel. 1919, Hitler penned a letter to a colleague that's known as the Gramm-Leach letter. It was all about how horrible the Jews were. Here's Hitler in 1920, and it's a coming out party for him on February 24th, 1920. He delivers the Nazi Party platform speech to a large crowd in Munich, an event that is often regarded as the foundation of Nazism. The German Workers' Party had existed. Hitler, who was a great orator, laid out a 25-point platform. Central idea: strengthen German citizenship, exclude and control the Jewish people and others who are non-German. There's a little problem with this because Hitler was born in Austria in 1889. He's not German. So under his 25-point plan, Adolf Hitler would not be eligible to stay in Germany. And there he is. At that time, he's about 32 years old. By blaming the Jews for the World War I defeat, Hitler created this stereotypical enemy. According to the Austrian citizen Hitler, expelling the Jews was the solution to all problems in Germany. Hitler established himself as the absolute Führer of the NSDAP, using contacts made with former military circles, especially the well-known Air Force ace Hermann Göring and the former Army captain Ernest Röhm. Hitler set out to grow the party. The treaty restoring friendly relations on behalf of the United States and Germany at Berlin was signed on August 25th. It did not reestablish peace between the United States and Germany. The United States was still at war, and that had started on April 6, 1917, and that war was declared at an end with a public resolution on July 2nd. But peace between the two countries not established. Flapper, is that your mother? That was your mother.
Yes, sir.
Olive Thomas, The Flapper. That was a movie. Selznick. Most women in the United States got the right to vote in 1920. Women had to fill men's roles in work during World War I between April 4th, 1917 and November 11th, 1918. But the times were changing. The first appearance of the flapper style in the United States came from the popular 1920 Francis Marion film, The Flapper, starring Olive Thomas. Thomas starred in a similar role in 1917, but it was not until that movie came out that the flapper term was used. And that could have been your mother, right? Going into a speakeasy. You have pictures like that?
Yes.
You have
She
pictures
went
like
to Erasmus High School in Brooklyn
Yeah.
College.
in Brooklyn College. She went to speakeasies at night.
She knew how to make a good cocktail.
Then she went to speakeasies.
She was not an old lady.
She was a thoroughly modern woman back in the 1920s. And there are those women. Those women are going into the Crazy Cat bar. In the United States, popular contempt for prohibition was a factor in the rise of the flappers. With legal saloons and cabarets closed, back alley speakeasies became prolific and popular. This discrepancy between law-abiding, religion-based temperance movement and consumption of alcohol led to widespread disdain for authority, and I guess your mother had some disdain for authority back then. Unlike their mothers and grandmothers, flappers went to high school, like Erasmus,
Brooklyn College.
and college, Brooklyn College. The flappers went to work as well. Did she go to work?
Well, actually, she met my father.
Oh, she met your
had
father.
a business
And he
already.
had a, well, she must have worked in the business. Flappers did like earning money, and they wanted independence. That is Alice Paul. There is an Alice Paul Museum in New Jersey, and she wants equal rights for women. After women finally gained the vote with the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, groups that had led the suffrage movement ceased large-scale political activities. Divisions rose between women who wanted equal rights and those who sought to preserve special privileges women enjoyed in society. Alice Paul and the National Women's Party focused on the Equal Rights Amendment to guarantee women constitutional protection from discrimination. The Wisconsin legislature in 1921 passed the first equal rights bill in the nation, granting women full equality with men under civil law. The bill was signed into law by the Governor John James Blaine on July 11th and hailed by members of the Wisconsin Women's Party. But didn't have much teeth. It was pretty much meaningless. The only thing women could do was hold public office and serve on jury duty after that. So that could have been your mother, right?
I guess.
It could have been your mother. Yesterday a woman told me that her mother danced on tabletops. She's on the tabletop. She could have danced on the tabletop, right?
Yeah.
Flappers set the stage for a much more liberated view of women's sexuality in that they made it so women would no longer be considered impure, immoral, or dangerous for engaging in casual, consensual sexual activities. The flappers were a grave source of concern to their parents, educators, clergymen, doctors who feared that them playing sports and also going for higher education would ruin them. The flappers went to speakeasies, which was a place where they drank alcohol provided by gangsters. And in Brooklyn, she might have crossed paths with Meyer Lansky. You're not supposed to say that, right? Or Lucky Luciano.
Right.
Did she always, afterwards, when
They
she told
talked
you?
about it.
Yeah. Oh, they did talk about it. So she might have known who Meyer Lansky was.
No, she went to Brooklyn College and met my father.
Oh, okay. But she might have known. Meyer Lansky was a big guy.
I heard
in
the
Brooklyn.
name.
Yeah, yeah. Harpo Marx could get into a speakeasy. All you needed to know was the password. Swordfish. There he is. When Prohibition took effect on January 17, 1920, many thousands of formerly legal saloons across the country catering to men only closed. People wanting to drink had to buy liquor from a licensed druggist for medicinal purposes, clergymen for religious reasons, or illegal sellers known as bootleggers. Another option was to enter private unlicensed bar rooms nicknamed speakeasies because when you went there, you had to speak like that, give them the password. So you gave them the password, you went in and it's party time. They got the piano player there, they got the bands there, everything is going on, even though it was supposedly illegal. Prohibition was difficult to enforce, the demand for alcohol outweighing the demand for sobriety. People found clever ways to avoid prohibition agents. Hip flasks, hollowed canes, those guys walking down Fifth Avenue with their top hats and their sticks may have had booze in their sticks as they're walking in the Irving Berlin song, false books, and the like. Neither federal nor local authorities would commit the resources necessary to enforce the Volstead Act. In general, prohibition was enforced much more strongly in areas where the population was sympathetic to the legislation, mainly rural areas and small towns. And in urban areas like New York City, there were like 25,000 speakeasies. And a speakeasy could be something as simple as bathtub gin. Come up to the 5th floor, we're going to have a party. Speakeasy, that looks like a classy speakeasy. There were also many unintended consequences of prohibition. Cash-strapped restaurants shut down their doors. They can no longer make a profit from liquor license. Thousands of people died each year from drinking cheap moonshine tainted with toxins. Revenue shrank for many states that had previously relied on liquor taxes to fund roads, schools, and other public benefits. From Los Angeles to Chicago to New York, organized crime syndicates supplied speakeasies and underground establishments with large quantities of beer and liquor. These complex bootlegging operations used rivers, waterways to smuggle alcohol across state lines. The mobsters were seemingly 3 steps or 3 miles by boat ahead of law enforcement officials. Babe Ruth did not save baseball. Now, I'm going to ask a silly question. How many of you know who Babe Ruth was?
I've heard of him.
Heard of him. You don't know who Babe Ruth was?
No.
Well, here's the great baseball player. He was one of the great stars in the 1920s, not only in the United States.
I'm not a Yankee fan.
Well, you didn't have to be a Yankee fan to hear the name Babe Ruth. He was, like I said, he was up there with Jack Dempsey in boxing and Al Jolson and Charlie Chaplin, and then eventually Rudolph Valentino and those people. That is the high mark Charles Lindbergh of the 1920s started. He was a star pitcher for the Boston Red Sox between 1915 and 1919. He won 89 games, lost 46. He set a pitching record. He threw 29 in the 3rd consecutive scoreless innings in World Series play. But it would be his home run hitting that made him notable. He hit 11 in 1918, then a record 29 in 1919. But Babe Ruth did not save baseball. Boston Red Sox owner Harry Frazee sold Babe Ruth's contract to Jacob Rupert's New York Yankees in December 1919 for $125,000, $2.2 million today. Ruth hit 54 home runs and batted .376 for his new team in 1920. Same time, during the 1920 season, it was discovered that 8 members of the Chicago White Sox may have fixed the 1919 World Series. Despite the suspicions that the 1919 World Series was rigged, the 1920 season started and the previous World Series faded into oblivion. However, investigators were looking at allegations of a rigged 1920 regular season game between the Chicago Cubs and the Philadelphia Phillies. A grand jury convened to investigate, and speculation soon turned to the previous year's World Series. At the same time, the gambler Bill Marhak came up with a public account of his involvement in the fix. And these 8 guys were accused of fixing the World Series. Eddie Ciccone, the pitcher for the White Sox, decided to testify before the grand jury. I don't know why I did it. I needed the money. Had a wife and kids. Shortly after, the star hitter, Shoeless Joe Jackson, testified. Admitted he took $5,000, $90,000 today, from his teammates. Over the next few days, Lefty Williams and Oscar Felch also confessed their involvement. The Chicago White Sox owner, Charles Comiskey, suspended the 7 1919 players who were still members of his team a few days before the end of the 1920 season. And those are the 8 guys who were accused. On October 20th, 22nd, 1920, the grand jury handed down its indictments, naming the Chicago 8 players and 5 gamblers, including Bill Burns and Sport Sullivan and Abe Patel. The indictments included 9 counts of conspiracy to defraud various individuals and institutions. Meanwhile, Babe Ruth is hitting home runs, a lot of them. He was 26 years old. He's in his 2nd year playing for the Yankees. He revolutionized the game because of his home run hitting. Prior to Ruth, the game was characterized by small ball, playing for a run, like bunting and stealing bases. The Yankees' right fielder and sometimes pitcher won 2 games on the mound, but he hit 59 home runs, set a new record, drove in 168 runners, scored 177 times, 145 walks, hit 378. A phenomenal season. He is a star. He plays in New York, the communications capital of the United States. He was up there with Jack Dempsey, Al Jolson, a celebrity. The trial of the Chicago White Sox players was not in the mind of those who wanted to watch Babe Ruth play baseball. And that is the trial taking place in Chicago. On July 18th, the judge, Hugo Friend, charged the jury, told them to return a guilty verdict. They must find that the players conspired to defraud the public and not merely throw games. Not guilty. The 8 players are not guilty. It's August the 2nd, and they're not guilty on all counts. The players' vindication would not last long. A day after the acquittal, Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis, baseball's first commissioner, decreed that all 8 players were permanently banned from baseball. And there is Judge Landis. Regardless of the verdict of the juries, no player throws a game, no player that undertakes or promises to throw a baseball game, no player that sits in conference with a bunch of crooked players and gamblers where the ways and means of throwing a game are discussed and does not promptly tell his club about it will ever play professional baseball. Didn't matter. The Polo Grounds down the street there, 8th Avenue, 155th Street. That's the World Series in 1921. Nobody's worried about the Black Sox scandal as the World Series unfolds between the New York Giants and the New York Yankees. And of course, Babe Ruth is the star. Ruth's team lost 5 games to 3. Ruth was injured, missed the last 3 games. Attendance was good. The games were broadcast on radio. People were interested in Babe Ruth and baseball. Didn't care about the baseball commissioner Landis or the 8 White Sox players. Ruth brought in a new audience because of his ability to hit home runs. One other guy is thrown out of baseball, Joe Gideon. He didn't do anything. He was a friend of Swede Reisberg, who was present during the meeting with the gamblers as they discussed the plot to fix the 1919 World Series. He was called as a witness in the trial on November 3rd because he didn't report it to baseball. Gideon was banned for life from organized baseball for having guilty knowledge of the Black Sox scandal. Funny thing about this, though, paper records relating to the players' grand jury confessions vanished. They're just gone. You can't find them. Did the owner, Comiskey of the White Sox, and did Arnold Rothstein, the guy who put organized and organized crime, did they arrange for the papers to be stolen as part of a cover-up? The prosecution's case disappeared along with the confessions. This is David Sarnoff. He founded NBC. After the Titanic hit an iceberg near Halifax, Nova Scotia, on April 14, 1912, radio operators picked up SOS signals from the sinking ship. One of those radio operators was David Sarnoff, working at the Wanamaker's Manhattan store, where a telegraph station operated. How many of you remember Wanamaker's? Remember Wanamaker's?
I shopped there.
I shopped there. Long gone.
They had one up in the
Manhattan.
Yonkers.
Yonkers, where Macy's is now, and of course in Midtown.
Yonkers.
Yeah. 1915, 1916, Sarnoff wrote about the radio music box in a memo. And he proposed the development of a commercially marketed radio receiver for the use in the home. 1919, the Radio Corporation of America gets the Marconi radio station from the U.S. Navy. The first newscast was on this station, AMK Detroit. And it was owned by the Detroit News. It was August 31st, 1920, and they read the news from the newspaper, and maybe a couple hundred people heard them. On November 2nd, 1920, the George Westinghouse Labs KDKA Pittsburgh became the world's first commercially licensed radio station. First program, the Harding Cox Presidential Returns. Announcer Leo Rosenberg delivered the results at 6 o'clock. Well, Jack Dempsey is an international star. He's a big star. And David Sarnoff has this all figured out. We'll see how big a star that Dempsey is by putting the fight he is about ready to have on radio. And he does. Sarnoff had it all figured out for RCA to sell radios. Have to have programming, music, news, sports. And he arranges for the broadcast of the Jack Dempsey-George Carpentier fight. That takes place on July 2nd, 1921 at Boyle's 30 Acres in Jersey City, New Jersey. It generated the first $1 million gate in boxing history. 91,000 people watched the fight. And on radio, KDKA is carrying the fight. And people with radios could hear it. And there is Jack Dempsey. Dempsey would win in a 4-round knockout over Carpentier. But the big news on the July 2nd date of the fight, people bought radios to listen to the fight. And they would end up spending about $89 million in the next 3 years buying radios. First fight on radio featured this guy, Johnny Ray. That was on April 11th. It was out of Pittsburgh. It was
What year was that?
1921.
21.
It was on KDK in Pittsburgh, 10-round, no decision fight between Johnny Ray and Johnny Dundee in Pittsburgh. Harold Arlen. See how radio announcers used to dress? You couldn't see them, but they dressed like that. They thought getting on radio, they had to sound good and they had to dress good, even though nobody would ever see them. On August 5th, 1921, the first broadcast of a baseball game made on the Westinghouse station KDKA. Harold Arlen was the announcer of the Pittsburgh Pirates Philadelphia Phillies game. And Warren G. Harding gets involved, and he gives a presidential address on November 5th. It makes radio history as he sends a message across RCA's Radio Central Relay Network from the White House across the world, acknowledgments of the message received in Riverhead, New York, Australia, Japan, and 15 other countries. Fatty Arbuckle's mugshot. Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle was Hollywood's big star. Paramount Pictures paid him $3 million, $47 million today over 3 years to star in 18 silent films. And he just signed another $1 million contract with the studio. The comedian's latest film, Crazy to Marry, was playing in theaters across the country. His friend, Fred Fishback, planned a big party to celebrate a 3-day Labor Day bash at the St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco. But by the end of the week, Fatty Arbuckle was sitting in cell number 12 on Felony Row at the San Francisco Hall of Justice, held without bail in the slaying of 25-year-old actress Virginia Rappe. Crazy to Marry was pulled from all the theaters. Rappe died after attending a party with Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle, who was accused of manslaughter and rape in connection with the death. And there is Arbuckle, and there is Rappe. Arbuckle was scheduled for trial in November. San Francisco District Attorney Matthew Brady saw the case as a perfect opportunity to jumpstart his career in politics. But he's having a lot of trouble with his star witness, a woman by the name of Maud Delmont. Madam Black, Delmont procured young ladies for parties where wealthy male guests soon found themselves accused of rape and blackmail into paying Delmont. She is not a credible witness, but this could sell newspapers, this trial, and it did. William Randolph Hearst was truly an awful, awful, awful human being. Just awful. I want to just get that out of the way as a journalist telling you just how bad he was. His papers had a field day with the stories. The publisher would later say the Fatty Arbuckle scandal sold more papers than the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915. Brady proceeded to trial. The newspapers never questioned Delmont's version of events, and they kept flogging Arbuckle. Why? They wanted to sell newspapers. That's what they wanted to do. They were not interested in what might be the truth. Arbuckle's reputation was in shambles, even after his friends Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin vouched for his character. Arbuckle took the stand in his own defense. December 4th, the juries voted 10-2 for acquittal. It was way too late. His career was over. There she is, Miss America, but she wasn't Miss America in 1921. The Atlantic City pageant was designed to encourage visitors to stay in the resort past Labor Day, the traditional end of the season. First pageant held September 7th and 8th, with 8 finalists from cities in the Northeast competing for the title. 16-year-old Margaret Gorman, Miss Washington, D.C., was the overall winner, and she received a statue of a gold mermaid. Well, the 1921 legacy, Harding died in 1923 on August the 2nd of an apparent heart attack. He's always been regarded as traditionally one of the worst presidents in American history because of scandals around the Teapot Dome oil lease, which was orchestrated by a Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, who became the first cabinet member ever to serve jail time. Woodrow Wilson outlived Harding, dying on February 3rd, 1924. 1927, Nan Britton wrote a book called The President's Daughter. The Harding family tried to suppress The President's Daughter by buying up all existing copies and otherwise sanitize the accusation with help from political cronies and newspaper allies. Harding came up with the interstate highway. In 2015, genetic tests confirmed that Warren G. Harding had a daughter with Nan Britton. Historians contend it was Harding's lack of vision and his poor sense of priorities that positioned himself so low in the rankings of U.S. presidents. Yet he spoke out in favor of African American rights, began the nation's interstate road systems, embraced technologies such as radio, signed legislation to provide funding for maternity and child care. But Congress didn't like the fact that they were helping out mothers and infants. They took the funding away in 1929. Why? Well, it was a socialist threat. We didn't want to save mothers and babies. We wanted to take care of the socialist threat. Statue of Liberty shuts its door in 1924. The Johnson-Reed Act drastically cut the total number of immigrants allowed in each year and cut off immigration from Asia. It made permanent strict quota defined as 2% of the total population of each nationality in the United States in 1890. 1890, not 1920. They wanted to keep those Jews out and the others from Eastern Europe. They wanted to make sure the Northern and Western Europeans came in. The new system also required immigrants to apply for and receive visas before arriving and established the U.S. Border Patrol. And there was also a new term that started in 1924, which gets thrown around every day. It's called undocumented. Tulsa. The survivors of the Tulsa massacre never received government assistance or restitution for their losses. Within a week of the massacre, at least 6,000 of the remaining residents were detained in internment camps. They were issued identification tags, remained at the camps, some for months, could not leave without their tags, and permission from white supervisors. Oklahoma public schools weren't instructed to teach about the Tulsa race massacre until 2002. In 2021, Oklahoma Governor Kevin Stitt signed a bill that restricted what could be taught in classrooms about racial divisions through history in Oklahoma. The Republican government may have signed that bill, but there are books, documentaries, and movies about what happened in 1921 in Tulsa, and they cannot restrict people from reading about the Tulsa massacre. No Nazis came after the Nazis in Germany. That's Rostock, Germany. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party rose to power in 1932. Germany annexed Austria and Czechoslovakia in 1938. Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. That starts World War II. Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. The war ended in 1945. The Nazi Party outlawed in Germany. There's your mother. The flapper lifestyle and look disappeared at the end of the Roaring '20s. The glamour came to an end in America after the Wall Street crash in 1922. 1963, Betty Friedan released the book, The Feminine Mystique, reference to flappers. It was the start of the 1960s women's rights movement. Prohibition ended in 1933. Babe Ruth, none of the Chicago White Sox players accused and acquitted of fixing the 1919 World Series were allowed to return to organized baseball. Shoeless Joe Jackson would become a successful businessman in South Carolina, barred from Baseball Hall of Fame considerations. Babe Ruth may have been the greatest player ever to play baseball. He looms over the game today. He was up there with Al Jolson, Jack Dempsey, Charlie Chaplin, who loved family. There is Jack Dempsey, the Manasseh Mauler, the world heavyweight champion between 1919 and 26. The Dempsey-Cartier fight helped sell radios, and in 1923, his fight against Argentina's Luis Angel Firpo helped popularize radio in Argentina. Radio's golden age ended sometime in the early 1930s, or began in the early 1930s, ended 1955 when the Jack Benny Show ended. Today, radio stations have little value, and companies routinely are filing for bankruptcy. This guy was in the cabinet of Warren G. Harding, and his name was Will Hayes. Despite being acquitted of the rape and murder of Virginia Rappe, Fatty Arbuckle professionally was ruined and unable to find steady work in films. Harding's campaign manager and his postmaster general, Will Hayes, became the first chairman of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America. His job, clean up Hollywood, which was filled with scandals, saved the studios. In 1930, Hayes put moral clauses in performers' contracts, came up with the Hays Code, do's and don'ts in movies. There she is, Miss America. 1940, the Atlantic City pageant became the Miss America pageant. Miss America left Atlantic City for the first time in 2006, went to Las Vegas, returned to Atlantic City in 2013. Atlantic City decided not to give public funding to keep the event in town. 2019, the pageant ended up in the Connecticut casino. The Miss America pageant was once ingrained in American culture, but now has been marginalized to the point where it is no longer on network TV. Any questions, any comments? Your turn to talk.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
Very, very interesting.
Thank you. And that is what
So
happened.
do I.